Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the government and political correspondent, and it's that season or year of elections, and we have another candidate here, and I'm pleased to introduce Diane Odeen, who's running for state senate. Diane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jamie.
Now, Diane, why don't we start with just telling folks a little bit about your background.
Okay. I grew up on a dairy farm outside of Black River Falls, Wisconsin, and I currently live in River Falls, Wisconsin. I have to tell you, it was about 10 years. I had to live there about 10 years before I didn't say Black in front of it. I am an attorney in River Falls. I also serve on the city council. I have family scattered across the state and am married to a professor at the University of Wisconsin.
Right. Well, and people might recognize the name from a couple years ago. You ran for assembly, is that right?
Yes, I did.
All right. And that was in the 30th district, so that includes one township in Pierce County, the city of River Falls, and then the western third of St. Croix County.
Yes, that's correct. I ran against Dean Knutson in 2012.
All right. Well, then you can join the club of running against popular incumbents from St. Croix County. I think they could start a category on Jeopardy. And Sheila Harsdorf and Kitty Rhodes and Dean Knutson would be somewhere in the dollar amounts. I'm not sure where, but you are running against Sheila Harsdorf. That's something else that I have in common with you. 20 years ago, I ran against her.
That's when I met
assembly. You. Yeah. So it was 20 years ago, and that was actually her last term in the assembly. I think she retired from the assembly, took 2 years off, and then ran for state senate. And she's been in there now since, that would make it, let's see, 2016 years.
She's been 16 years in the Senate, and yes, she was first elected to state office in 1988, so it's been a long time.
All right. So pretty hard to avoid the career politician label if you've been in for, what, 4 terms in the Senate and six terms
in the Assembly.
You've started, a political career, I guess, running for Assembly, and then the very next April, after your loss in the Assembly race, ran for City Council.
Right. I ran for City Council in River Falls and defeated an incumbent, and I was reelected this past a year ago in 2015. And I currently serve as the comptroller of the city, and I'm also on the Utility Advisory Board.
Okay, now tell me about this. So you serve as comptroller. What are those duties?
That's just basically overseeing the finances, being like the person on the city council who is responsible for signing the contracts and making sure the finances have some oversight by the elected officials.
Okay. And what is it with your city council experience in the last couple of years? What do you consider an accomplishment or something that prepares you to be in the state senate?
Actually, I think it's very pertinent. People still basically trust local government, and I think that's because people, you live with the people you represent. I mean, people stop me in the grocery store or on the street and say, what's going on with this, or, I've got an opinion on that. So you really stay in touch with people that you're representing. And also, being on city council is a nonpartisan position. So we deal with things that we might have different opinions on, but we all agree on things like, the streets ought to be plowed, we ought to have a wonderful library, the police ought to show up when they're called. And we figure out ways to get that done. So it's been a great experience learning to work with others and actually getting things done.
Okay. So before we get into the issues that, why, if it didn't work out for the Assembly, why are you pursuing the state senate then?
Well, when I ran for the Assembly, it was 2012. It's been 4 years now. 4 years of Republican politics controlling Wisconsin, and this year is a year that I think there's a lot of unrest with the status quo and with career politicians. Wisconsin has fallen behind in some key measures, and I think that people are interested in some change, in some positive change.
All right, so let's get to those issues then. Start with, you mentioned the 3 E's when we were off air: education, economy, environment. I don't know which order you want to take those, but you started mentioning about the measures of Wisconsin falling behind. So let's start with the economy.
Sure. Over the last, well, really 5 years, Wisconsin has trailed in its recovery from the Great Recession. We only have to look at the Wisconsin budget versus Minnesota's budget, where they have enjoyed a surplus and a booming economy, which has actually spilled over into western Wisconsin. So I know that a lot of people work in the Twin Cities, and they're doing quite well. But out further away from the border, communities are suffering. One measure of that is just internet connectivity with broadband. Minnesota is well wired, Wisconsin is not. It's very difficult to start a business or even have your kid do their homework if you can't connect to broadband.
I would think that the internet's been around. It's not as newfangled as it was when I ran 20 years ago. So why the delay? What has caused Wisconsin to fall behind? What's the
Republican policies that have given benefits to large corporations that have monopolies on certain areas, and that only really need to. They can take money that we pay in on our bills, which was set aside for expansion, and they don't actually have to promise to expand. They can use it if they see fit to expand in certain areas, but they're still governed by a profit motive. Once upon a time, we invested in infrastructure, in roads, in bridges, in electricity, in...
That was in the Depression, right? During
Yeah,
the 1930s.
Yes, a long time ago.
And Eisenhower.
And Eisenhower. And it's taken a long time to develop a strong infrastructure around the country, and it requires maintenance and sometimes updating. And we do some of this in River Falls. I told you I was on the Utility Advisory Board, and we are working on renovating our sewer system. It's not glamorous, but it's infrastructure, and it's going to mean that we can bring in more businesses in our industrial parks because the infrastructure is solid.
Now, we are told constantly that the road to more jobs and is to cut taxes, and that's the road to more jobs. How has that worked out in Wisconsin with the tax cuts that have been coming down over the last 6 years?
Well, it hasn't, and I have not seen any evidence that it's ever worked in any state. Just as in your personal budget, you get money by investing in things, and we have not invested in our communities and our people. Or education is one of those things. We can get to another E.
Right.
Education is one of the things Wisconsin does really well. I grew up, my parents met at UW-Madison, and I grew up hearing the fight songs sung as lullabies and knowing that Wisconsin was special because we had this great university system and everyone lived within driving distance of at least a 2-year campus and could get a really great education close to home. And we did public education almost better than anybody else, and the university showed it. We turned out lots of graduates, and they were skilled and innovative and helped create a great economy for the state. Well, that has been eroded so much that the university ratings are starting to suffer. And I know education in the classroom level is starting to suffer because it's difficult for any of the campuses to retain good, qualified, experienced educators because there are better job opportunities elsewhere.
Now, to be fair, the erosion of the education system is somewhat of a bipartisan issue because it hasn't been just the last 6 years, although it seems to have accelerated a little bit more in the last 6 years. We've got a combination of how much in the budget cuts now?
There were $250 million the last cycle.
And that's from where it was. Now, and these are not like freezing the budget and calling it the failure to get a $250 million. It's an actual cut of $250 million.
Yes, it's a baseline cut. And it's affected, well, I know at River Falls and Stout, I've spoken to both the chancellors, and they're both very concerned with the fact that they have nowhere else to cut except personnel. And
then tuition's been frozen for...
Tuition has been frozen.
For 3 years now?
I believe so.
Going on the 4th, I think.
And that sounds wonderful if you're a student. It's great to have low tuition. Wisconsin's tuition has historically been very low and very reasonable. And that's good, but when you don't get the state picking up the slack, what it actually means is that there are fewer programs being offered, fewer classes, and it might take you 5 or even 6 years to get your degree rather than just 4. So it looks like a bargain, but it might not be.
And I have friends on the Board of Regents and so forth, and they're being told, well, tell the professors, tough, instead of 2 classes, they can teach 3 in a semester and just be more productive. Why isn't that the answer?
I would welcome them to shadow a professor on a typical day. There is a lot of classroom preparation, there's a lot of advising, there's committee work, there is just a lot of work to be done. And it's like telling the legislature, well, you should spend more days in Madison to get your work done. We're not satisfied with what you're doing. It really takes a lot of work to be a teacher.
And we've heard rumors about educators leaving our system to go to other places, in, for instance, the Big Ten.
I know some of them.
Okay, I was going to ask you, do you know of actual stories where that's true?
Yes, I talked to Chancellor Bob Meyer at Stout a number of weeks ago, and he was talking about one of the professors that they'd lost who'd won state awards for being a great professor in the UW system, and he'd left for a tech college position that paid him $20,000 a year more. At River Falls, I could tell you a number of similar stories, but I'll mention just one. There was a professor who was hired in the summer of, well, actually it was the spring of 2015. Came from Minnesota with a wonderful background, great young teacher, stayed 1 year and then left because of all the stress from the cuts. The original pool of applicants for that position had been several dozen people. The search was reopened the following year to fill that vacancy, and they got maybe 6 or 8 applicants. The pool was diminished and they weren't as qualified.
Okay, that is concerning. Now, the education cuts, you mentioned UW, K through 12, which I happen to be working on a little bit over the last 3 years, being on the school board in Hudson. What do you think that you'll be able to do down in Madison regarding that?
Hopefully, if the Democrats take a majority, we can take a look at funding K-12 and do it on a basis that actually funds schools as much as they need. Right now, schools have a hard time planning because of the way the budget is assessed and assigned, and it's very difficult for them to keep good teachers if they can't, if they can't promise them raises or even enough resources to keep.
Well, we feel a little bit more being on the border here, and your district is certainly a border district. I guess we failed to get into that when we started. Was the 10th Senate district is made up of 3 assembly districts. You got the 30th, which is in western St. Croix County, but the 29th, which is the rest of St. Croix County, plus western Dunn County and Menominee City, and then the most of Polk County and half of Burnett is in the 28th.
Right, that's correct.
So you go all the way up north of Danbury and all the way down to River Falls and over to Menominee, basically.
Yes, it's a big district.
But with that's a lot of western border there, and with Minnesota being on the other side, they have teachers who still can unionize and have higher pay, better benefits.
Right.
Makes it tough to compete.
It does make it very tough to compete, and I know many districts have trouble even getting applicants. There were several positions in River Falls, and I think probably in Hudson and across the Senate district of positions that were open, but they couldn't get qualified people to even apply.
Well, you mentioned in your website the fact that since 2008, state support for school districts has plunged about 14% with per pupil decreases in funding, being the 4th worst in the nation. I think we're still better than Mississippi and Alabama, but
that's not a good record.
Yeah.
Especially with an economy that's not been recovering very fast. It's innovators and small businesses that actually create the most jobs in Wisconsin, not big corporations. So, and that happens when there is an educated workforce, when there are re-educational opportunities, and when there's a culture that cultivates that.
How about the expansion of the voucher program? Have you seen any evidence there where that has increased any efficiency?
No, in fact, it takes money directly out of the public school pot and gives it to unaccountable voucher schools that aren't in District 10. Most of them are in the southeastern part of the state, and there have been horror stories, of course, about schools closing in the middle of the night or failing to serve their students. And I don't think that's a wise use of taxpayer dollars.
And I think I saw something where nearly 85% of the people who applied for vouchers had been sending their kids to private schools anyway, so it wasn't like they were sending their kids to public schools, failing public schools. So
right, we were just subsidizing their choice to opt out of the system.
All right, well, we talked about the economy, and again, we should mention we're talking to Diane Odeen, who's a candidate for the 10th Senate District here in Wisconsin. She's from River Falls and has been working on these issues for a while with, we've mentioned the economy and the education. How about, well, and the environment. Let's finish the 3 E's and then we'll get to local control and clean government. But
okay, well, one of the, you mentioned the district extending up to north of Danbury, and up there in Lake Country, people love their water. Of course, we do here too, but their economy depends on having beautiful lakes and tourists. And the current legislature, surprisingly, spearheaded by Adam Jarko and Senator Tiffany, have passed a lot of legislation that decreases the ability of local government to appropriately regulate their lake shores. Makes it easier for people to develop, makes it harder for communities to protect their lakes.
Aren't they just trying to promote jobs? Isn't that the dichotomy that you have? If you want jobs, you're going to have to give a little on the environment?
This isn't about jobs. This is about mostly development of houses on lakes, as far as much of the legislation that I'm talking about, the shoreline development. And the economy is the environment there. If you have fewer tourists, your economy takes a hit.
Okay. Now let's get to local control then, having been on a local governmental unit, and what impact there you mentioned on your website again about local zoning.
Right. Well, I just mentioned one, the ability to zone your lake shores. Another would be the ability to have stricter regulations for landlords. I mean, River Falls currently does not have stricter regulations for landlords than the state does, but we're a college town. We might at some time decide to do that because we have a large percentage of housing units that are rentals, or just runoff from construction sites. We're not allowed to regulate that any more strictly than the state, and we have the Kinnickinnic River that we want to protect. So the current legislature has passed over 120 bills that either give an unfunded local mandate to local government or take away local control.
And this take away local control, that's the ability of local taxpayers to say, yes, this is what we want. We want quality schools. We want to be able to spend the money on that. But Madison has imposed these caps. Doesn't Madison just know best what's best for us here in local areas?
I think that people who live here know best what to do, and that Madison should trust us to make our own decisions.
I think we've seen some of that with the referendums in the K-12, like for this last year. What did they pass at a rate of nearly 75%, which is historically excellent, but the number of referendums required has also, I think, doubled in like 10 years. Right,
and many of those referendums are for operating expenses, which is a clear indication that these schools do not have the funding that they need to operate without imposing their own referendum.
Well, I know when I ran 20 years ago, and Sheila Harsdorf and I were debating this very issue, and she said that the state has a commitment to 2/3 funding by state aid. And now here in Hudson, for the second annual budget year in a row, we're going to be under 50% in state aid, and our share of being funded by property taxes is only growing. And yet they want to impose restrictions on the property taxes as well, not just the state aid.
Right. It's almost as if they are determined to starve public education. It's also happening on the university level too, with caps on what those schools can use. But it is shifting. Historically, it's been shifting the burden from the state to the individual or the family. For the student, it's might take longer to graduate, or their family is paying higher property taxes because the state's paying less.
Okay, and then finally, I think this is another E. It could be ethics, but clean and transparent government. What have we seen over the last several years?
Well, the last several years have been an interesting approach to government in Madison. There's been a pattern of introducing large bills at the very last minute and passing things in the middle of the night, or in a very condensed time frame, so there's very little public input even possible. And I mean, nobody makes good decisions at 2:30 in the morning. So I think that's just been one measure of how they're trying to. They seem determined not to let us know what they're doing. Another is all the dispute about what is open government. What does open government mean? What kind of records can we get from the people we've elected? As far as I'm concerned, the people who are elected work for the people who elected them, and we should be able to see exactly how they make decisions and who they make those decisions with.
Well, what we've seen is a pattern where there's going to be an investigation into some dealings, and then what we'll do is just change the rule to make the activity that's being investigated now legal. And now, since it's legal now, what's the point in trying to investigate something that's only formally illegal?
Right, exactly. That's, if you're trying to hide something, there's probably a reason. Another thing about clean and open government is the destruction of the Government Accountability Board. That was an institution that was created in the mid-2000s, and I believe Senator Harsdorf voted for it, and it was created in the wake of a number of scandals in government in Madison, where people were misusing their offices for campaigning. And
it's supposed to be nonpartisan.
Right.
And it was appointed with former judges.
Right, and it was a model for the nation. Frankly, everyone looked at Wisconsin and said, wow, that's a great idea, and it worked very well. And now it's been divided into two different areas, elections and ethics, and with political appointees on it. And if you've got a choice between having an oversight organization that is nonpartisan and one that's partisan, I think nonpartisan is always better.
I mean, you don't think that the trend in Washington, where things have gotten more partisan, isn't a better way for Madison to go? Just make things more partisan?
No, we used to be a state that got along with each other. I have an uncle-in-law who used to serve as a Republican Assembly representative, and he's told me wonderful stories about how you'd argue with people on the floor, you'd be angry and pound your fists about a bill, but then when it was all said and done, you'd reached a compromise, you'd go and have a drink with the people you were arguing with, just moments before. And I think that that cooperation and a certain amount of give and take yields better government.
Rather than one part or the other just stonewalling,
Right.
maybe leaving the state in protest.
Or maybe not allowing the other party to have a floor hearing, or even a seat at the table.
Okay, well, have we covered the areas that you wanted to emphasize then?
Oh, I think so. This is an exciting year for elections. I mean, we're taping this the week of the Republican National Convention, and with the Democratic Convention close behind, and it's with all the recent unrest across the world, people are paying attention to politics, and yet it's a kitchen table issue too. I mean, Wisconsin families that I talk to are worried about their economic future, the economic future for their children, and it all boils down to how can elected representatives best represent those kitchen table values.
Well, when Dean Knutson was on here a couple months ago, and we taped a segment about his retirement after 3 terms and so forth, and he talked about how he's going to be a delegate, and he's there in Cleveland right now as a Ted Cruz delegate, and there was uncertainty at that point what was going to happen because it was before Trump's win in Indiana. So I'll pose this question to you: what impact do you see, because the negatives of the top of the ticket for both parties are so high? What impact do you think that that's going to have on the down-the-ticket races such as yours?
Well, I think that in some ways people might focus more on down-ticket races because the volumes turned up to 11 on the national races. But local government is important. State government is very important. So people might be spending more time looking at my race or Russ Feingold's race, at the local assembly races, and a place where races where they can actually meet the candidates, where there's certainly a higher level of civility so far.
Okay.
We can't fix everything at once in terms of the tone of an election, but if we get involved and all pay attention and speak to each other civilly, I think we can move the discussion forward.
Well, last month was the filing of the nomination papers and getting officially on the ballot. You have no primary opposition.
That's correct.
And we're in midsummer. I assume that you've had a few parades under your belt and a few more to go.
Yes, I think almost every municipality in Polk County has a parade.
Yeah. So you have that to look forward to. But the campaigns are more than just parades.
Right.
What about, are there going to be debates? Are there going to be forums? And has there been any discussion about that?
I assume there will be. There always are. Those are usually organized by other organizations and not the campaign. I know that public radio is planning to have a debate in October. Usually the League of Women Voters holds a candidate forum or a debate, and I know there are some educational groups and other groups that are looking to schedule those things, but that probably won't happen until September and October.
Yeah, River Falls and Menominee,
right.
Something over there.
Right.
Well, and finally, from having run a state office campaign or run in one, that it's talk a lot about money. And where is that? What are your prospects, or what is your projections for what's going to be needed to raise? I remember the infamous Harsdorf-Klausing fight where Sheila then took this seat, and I think that they were spending over $100,000.
Right. It is money.
It was a lot of money back then.
It was a lot of money back then. I'll tell you now, I'll raise more than $100,000 to campaign for this seat, and so will Senator Harsdorf. She'll raise more money than I will. But it's not just money, it's talking to people too. So, but that's one of the issues in government on both a state and national level is Citizens United, and the problem that money in politics has created. And while you need money to campaign, and I'll have some of that, you also need people.
Okay. Well, how does somebody get to know more about you, possibly volunteer? I know you have a website. Why don't you tell the folks?
My website is www.dianeodeen.org, and it's DIANEODEEN.org.
So it's Diane with one N, Odeen with two E's.
Right.
And it's just .org, so nothing about the Senate or anything like that.
Right, no, just my name.
All right.
And there was a button for connecting with me and telling me what it is you'd like to do to help my campaign, and it also tells you a bit more about me and some of my positions.
Very good. Well, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for watching another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, and I look forward to having you as a visitor at our next candidate forum.